Today we are honored to receive Professor Hirt. He is Senior Lecturer and Coordinator for International Relations at the School of Business, Economics and Social Sciences in the Department of Human Resources Management at the University of Graz in Austria. You know? You know the university? Yeah. Well, he will tell us about it if you want. His conference will be about the concept of responsibility in Europe and Japan, analyzing especially the cultural differences. Well, I want to say that if you want to ask any question, you can at the end of the conference in English or in Spanish, as you prefer, because we can translate if it's necessary, okay? Well, okay, welcome, Professor.
Gracias, Eloisa, por presentarme. De verdad, no hablo español. Antes de viajar a Uruguay, decidí tomar algunas horas intensivas en español para comunicarme un poco con ustedes. Es un gran honor poder darle una conferencia sobre la responsabilidad empresarial en contexto internacional, pero no puedo decir más en español, por eso comienzo a hablar en inglés. Gracias por su comprensión. Muchas gracias. Okay, this is much easier for me. So I'm going to give my lecture in English now, and I'm going to talk about the concept of responsibility in Europe and Japan. And when I refer to Europe particularly, I will refer to the German context, to the Germanic countries, because Europe, as you know, is a very diverse region as well, and we have many different cultures. But actually we did research in the context where I come from, and Austria is one of the Germanic countries, apart from Germany and Switzerland. So Europe in the context of the German countries. So what am I going to talk about? First of all, I will tell you a little bit about the particularities of the Japanese culture, because the West will refer to Japan, or the history will refer to Japan, and the West will refer to German countries. And I think in order to understand the concept of responsibility, it will be necessary also to know the key features of the Japanese culture, or the Asian cultures more generally speaking. But of course, for the Asian context, the same applies. Japan is different from China, and China is different from Korea, so we cannot put everything in one nutshell and say those all the Asian countries. There are very specific features, but all those features will have influence on how the concept of responsibility is being perceived by the representatives of those countries. And of course, you have to make some restrictions, and therefore the focus on German context and Japan. Then I will refer, of course, to the concept of responsibility, some implications, and I will illustrate the findings by presenting you two case studies we researched. The paper, as you can see, was published in 2013, and there was already a previous version which was published in German, because we speak German in Austria, so that's our native language. But in order to be able to present this also to a more international audience, yes, we also decided to have a similar version published in English. If you're interested, I can provide you with the original paper as well, in either German or English, whatever you prefer. Unfortunately, not in Spanish. Yeah, just to start off, because as I said, responsibility, according to our findings, is strongly linked to culture. And therefore, I would like to introduce some pictures, basically 4 pictures. Maybe you've seen those pictures before, but they were actually designed by a Chinese artist. And with regard to the 4 pictures, China and Japan are very similar. Therefore, I chose them for this presentation as well. And what do these pictures show? The pictures basically show that, well, we have to consider that the Western world is very different from the Eastern world. And let me start with the first one. Do you have any ideas what this could be about? Or at least which is the Western world and which side is the Eastern world? The Asian world and the European world? Yeah, it has to do with personal distance. So compared to Asia, in the West we have much more space. It's more crowded, more populated in the Asian world, and this also has effects on, or will affect how people live together. And in particular, when we talk in terms of culture, we talk about individualism and collectivism. More collectivist cultures or more individualistic cultures. And again, there we have to be very careful not to generalize, because as I said before, Europe is very diverse, and of course we have more individualistic cultures, and in Europe we also have collectivist cultures. Whereas in the Asian context, you will hardly find an individualist culture. So therefore, the red part on the right-hand side is the picture of the Eastern world, of Asia, of Japan, of China, of Korea, with a high collectivism, whereas the blue part is, again, Europe in terms of the German context, very individualistic. So if you look into cultural dimensions, for example, there are those famous cultural studies with regarding the business context by Hofstede. Hofstede found out that Germany, Switzerland, Austria, we are individualistic countries. Yeah? And therefore we have more personal space as well. The picture actually is titled A Sunday on the Streets, and I think that is also very, very interesting, because those of you who've been to Germanic countries, you might have noticed that on a Sunday the streets are quite empty. Why is that the case? Because we have very strict regulations regarding opening times of shops. For example, in Austria, on a Sunday, all shops have to be closed by law, because that comes from our past, and a university is Catholica, so we are a Catholic country as well, which meant that the Sunday is the day where you should have rest, and therefore the shops have to be closed. And of course there are many people, many representatives who want the shops to be open now, in particular business companies. But a lot of people then say, no, if we cannot rest on a Sunday, we don't need the shops to be open all the time. But of course, this also has to affect what is happening on the streets. If you go to the main streets, they will be empty. Whereas in the Asian world, it's always crowded, because Sunday is one of the main shopping days. So you meet a lot of people. I don't know, Uruguay probably the same, because the shops are open on the weekend. So you might find a lot of people outside as well, depending where you go. So if you go on the streets, probably more people. This does not mean that in Austria people do not go out on a Sunday, but they spend their time somewhere else. They go out to the countryside or enjoy somewhere else, but not in the shopping centers or not in the center of towns. So this is the first big difference. I think from a cultural side, this one is also very interesting. Again, the blue part represents the West, and the red part represents the East. What can we see there? So there's a big circle in the middle, and then someone is moving towards the circle. Well, the big circle is something we call a problem. So if we have a problem, what do? We basically approach the problem directly. We address the problem. That doesn't mean that we always go for confrontation, but if we have a problem, we try to sort it out. What happens in the Asian world? Completely the opposite. So you always try to avoid the problem. So as you can see, you walk around the circle. And why is that the case? Because this is rooted in culture as well. It means that in highly collectivist societies and in the Asian world, they have different concepts and principles they live up to. For example, the principle of harmony. So in whatever situation you find yourselves, you should try and preserve harmony. And this is something, this is also important for us, but not that important. And sometimes it's very difficult for us to understand, and in particular when we interact with people from the East, that they have a completely different way of thinking. Yeah, we would never think of preserving harmony. For example, put yourself in a company context and you have a problem with your boss. The question is, would you address this problem directly? Would you speak to your boss about that? Or would you have to try and get someone else to talk about your problem to your superior? That makes a big difference. For us, it would be out of question. We would never involve anyone else because, again, we're more individualistic as well. But if we have this problem and it concerns me and my boss, I have to sort it out with the boss and not someone else. But as I said, in Asian cultures, it's not as simple because they have to obey to hierarchies, for example. And sometimes you're not supposed to address someone who is superior to you. Or you cannot jump a hierarchy. For example, if there is a middle management, you cannot go to top management and talk to the people there. This is actually impossible, because then you would disturb the harmony that is necessary in the society, and that kind of dominates all interactions of your life. Then there is another interesting picture which I think is not always accurate anymore, but in particular when I grew up it was still true. This refers to a completely different side of life. Now it refers to food. As you can see, there's the symbol for cold, warm, cold. So the typical question is, how do people eat? And in Austria in the past, and when I grew up, our breakfast was always cold. Then the main meal was at lunchtime. That was a warm lunch, and in the evening again we had cold food in terms of sandwiches, sausages, cheese or whatever, but not cooked. And this is one of the main differences, because if you compare to Asian countries, what is their main food? Well, the main food is rice. And rice you can only eat when it's cooked. So rice is warm in the morning, rice is warm at lunchtime, rice is warm in the evening. Then another feature is they eat soup. Soup is always cooked. You eat soup in the morning, you eat soup at lunchtime, you eat soup in the evening. We would never eat soup in the morning. We would hardly eat soup in the evening. But as I said, now due to globalization, this has changed a little bit, and due to work life, because nowadays people, yes, in general have a cold breakfast apart from the coffee, but whatever they eat is cold. And then for lunchtime, people don't always have time to go for a real lunch, so they probably just have a sandwich, which is cold food again, and this has shifted to the evening. Then after work, when people come home, then they start cooking and have the proper dinner. So probably you, in the Western side or in the Germanic context, you can shift that a little bit, and you could say, well, it's rather cold, cold, warm. Or it could still be cold, warm, cold. But as I said, when I grew up, after school, I came home and that was the main food, and that was always warm food. And of course, food has to do with culture as well, because in cultural theories, they always say, well, we all have universal problems, but then we have to find solutions to this universal problem. And the solutions we find, they are different from culture to culture. For example, the universal problem would be we all have to eat something, but what we eat is culture specific. In Austria, the main nutrition is bread. And the bread we have is dark bread. Probably I haven't even seen the dark bread here, but it's typical dark bread, yeah, with a hard crust. That's our bread. What we understand by bread, of course, we get white bread as well, but it wouldn't be common. Yeah? You can buy a baguette or you can buy everything, but the real food would be dark brown bread. Yeah? Again, now in the other context, the Asians, how do they solve the universal problem of food? They have rice. Yeah? In other European countries, in the Irish context, the main food are potatoes. Yeah? Maybe if you live at the sea, the main food could be fish. Yeah? It depends. Yeah? And therefore every culture comes up with its own characteristics. And then one more of those pictures, which is quite interesting, and this is all about relationships. And what we can see here is that in the Asian context, we have a lot of lines and points that are all connected, and it's very complex and very confusing somehow. Whereas in the Western context, it's more organized, let's say. You have, of course, networking is important everywhere in business life as well nowadays. But what we have is, we have certain points and we have some specific connections. We choose our friends, we choose our network, we choose the people we would like to cooperate with in the Western world or in Germany, in Austria, Germany, wherever. Whereas in Asia, what happens? So it's all interwoven. So if you know someone, then you're also part of a group. And this member of the group is part of another group again. So the network is much more complex. Yeah? And for example, if you have to deal with bureaucracy, then you can move through this network more easily because you have the right connections. And this is always the problem. Also, if you refer to the original artist who was Chinese, as I said before, in China they have this network of bureaucracy, this Guangxi. And so if you go to China and you don't know anyone and you want to establish business, it will be very difficult to establish business because you're just lacking the right contact person. If you have one person who is part of this network, then you can more easily get through the bureaucracy. Yeah? And this is not the case in the Western world. Yeah? So, as you can already see, there are many, many differences, and if you're interested in that, the artist is quite famous too, because she grew up in China half of her life, and then lived half of her life in Berlin, in Germany, and so she's familiar with both cultural contexts, and that's how she actually came up with those ideas. And she painted many more pictures, but I just want to show you a few examples, just to give you an idea of what the big difference is about. Now let's get to the context of Japan. And this is, of course, also from the German context. It's from a German source. There's some very interesting features. So I don't know if any one of you has been to Japan before, but the first time if you go to Japan, then you will be kind of confronted with things you probably never experienced before, because it's very, very different. And some of those differences are summed up in this little statement. So what do? They dry themselves with wet towels. Something that might sound a little bit stupid now, but you again have to know about the context. For us, a towel always has to be dry, and I think also in Uruguay, if you get out of the bath and you want to dry your body, then you need a dry towel, not a wet one. But in Japan, they have this so-called bath culture, and they use very small little towels. So those towels, when you just dry your arm, it will be completely wet. And so you just rub the wet off your body, and then you squeeze out the towel again, but the towel is constantly wet, and somehow it works as well. Yeah, but it's somehow strange, it's weird if you experience the first time. Then they eat meat cold, meals cold. What does that mean? Well, what is the most famous food from Japan? It's sushi, sashimi, the raw fish. So for us, fish has to be cooked. Yeah. Nowadays, again, due to globalization, of course, we have Japanese restaurants as well, and we can appreciate their cuisine, but it's not the traditional way of how we prepare or eat fish. Yeah? So that is different. Then the slurp soup after dinner. Well, for us, in the Western world, soup is always a starter. The soup comes first. So you order soup, then you order your main course, and then you order your dessert. But we would never eat soup in the end. Whereas in Japanese context, you get many different things at once, and then soup is most of the time the thing you eat last, which is strange to us as well. Then, well, they also put traffic lights behind the intersection. For us, the traffic light is always, well, in front of the intersection, but some of the intersections are really huge. So you need more traffic lights, and most of them are on the other side of the intersection. I don't know about Uruguay, no, I haven't really observed that yet, but for us, very, very strange. So you have to get used to that as well, because you don't really know where to look at, when you go by car. Then, of course, I think this is a very well-known feature. Asians in particular, and also Japanese, they normally smile. They always have a happy face. And this happy face does not really mean that they are happy, but it's the face they show to the outside world. And they have these two concepts, this honne and the tatemae, and the tatemae face is the face that stands in front. However you feel, it doesn't matter. To the outside world, you always have to keep up appearance. That means you always have to smile, you always have to be happy, you always have to be friendly. And again, when you compare that, if you have a chance to go to Asia, or in particular to Japan, and you observe people on the streets, you will see nice facial expressions, happy facial expressions. Whereas if you come to Europe, this is not always the case. You see a lot of grumpy faces on the street, and people don't really, they show what mood they're in. They are more honest, you can say, as well. But in the Japanese context, well, they always have this, put on this happy face, which doesn't mean they always have to be happy. So that's a big difference too. The story with the hat. Well, Japanese often wear hats, and they wouldn't take off the hats. But they always take off shoes, because that's a common thing. If you go into an apartment, you have to take off your shoes. Sometimes in Austria as well, but it is considered impolite if you walk into a house, in particular into a church or in an official building, and if you leave your hat on. So we would always take off the hat, which again is different. And in university context, well, with us at the university, our students are always worried about their exams in the end of the semester, or their final exams, which will tell them whether they can pass their studies, finish their studies or not. Japan has a different system. They have entry examinations, and those entry examinations are very, very difficult. So everyone is scared about the entry examinations, but once you have passed the entry examinations, it means that for 4 years you study, but it's clear that you will finish your studies after 4 years. You attend courses, but you don't have to put that much effort into the courses anymore. The most important thing is in the very, very beginning of your studies, where you decide and where you try to get into one of the highly ranked universities or the best universities. And with us, completely different. Getting into the university is not that difficult, but then graduating from the university, the higher the level of education will become more and more difficult. So you see, there are only a few little things, and this German author, pointed out those little differences which make people think twice and rethink their own culture, and also why we operate or why we behave in a very specific way. Of course, where does this all come from? I already mentioned Japan, the Eastern world. Also, Japan is highly collectivistic. It's a collectivist society. What does that mean? So the group always counts more than the achievements of the individual. And where does this collectivism come from? So if you look a little bit into the Japanese concept, first of all, you have to consider their values, their moral concepts, which are derived from, first of all, religion. And the main religion is Confucianism. And in Confucianism, there are several principles. And those principles are, for example, from the old days, the subordination of the people to the king or to the emperor. then the high loyalty of friendship, then obedience of the son to the father, very important, the relationship between father and son, then the different roles of men and women in society, and also then the loyalty of younger people towards the elder people in society. Those are all values, principles that come from Confucianism. And the second strong influence also comes from the era of the samurai, because the samurai, they lived those principles. And there was also this subordination between the people and the samurai always protected the people, a specific group of people. And the people were loyal to the samurai because they knew that they can rely, and the samurai will always protect them. And those are things that will also be very important regarding the concept of responsibility afterwards, because how do we ascribe responsibility and how do we take over responsibility is highly rooted in those concepts. Then the second point, the group ideology. Group ideology, where does that come from? Well, if you look into history and also culture studies, they all refer to the topography of Japan. Japan is a country of several islands, and there are a lot of natural disasters, there are a lot of earthquakes, and also tsunamis, the high waves that come in. And as we said before, and that's why I also put this food slide in before, this comparison of food in the West and in the East. As we said before, well, the main food in Japan was always rice. And how can we cultivate rice? It's a very hard job, and it only works if a lot of people help together. In particular, if there also is the threat from the environment. Because if a storm comes, or if a flood comes, or a tsunami comes, or an earthquake, then the whole harvest is destroyed. And then again, you need a lot of people to replant everything. So it's not something one person can easily do. So therefore, people always had to work together in order to cope with the challenges of life. Also to survive, and that's why this group ideology is basically derived from. Then a very important feature is also this so-called family concept. The Japanese always say, well, even the organization is a family. You are embedded in your life in many, many different families, and they also use the term family for different groups. For example, when you grow up, of course you have your own family with your sisters, brothers, your parents, grandfathers, grandmothers, whoever, uncles, aunts. It's a larger family. But then people are also embedded maybe in a sports club, in a music club, to learn an instrument, whatever. They're always part of different groups. And all those groups are called families. And later on in the university, it's your family. It's a group of colleagues you always study with. It's another family. Then you finally start a job, and in the job the organization is also a family, and the Japanese also say uchi no kaisha, so our house, our organization is your family, and that's what they also live in the work context. So this family context is something that shouldn't be underestimated. And often when we talk about that in Europe, those are things that we can understand, but on the other hand cannot really understand because it's so far-fetched for us. Of course, family is important, but it depends on the context, and we would hardly say, well, my colleagues, now we have another family. But if you think of the Japanese context, probably you've heard of after-business socializing. So people, they work the whole day, and then in the evening they do not go home, but they go out with their colleagues. They have to go for a drink, and then they take the last subway, the last train home to the houses. Why? Because they have to cherish the relationship in the family context, in the business context as well. So you have to spend time with your colleagues just as if they were your family. Of course, your real family might suffer, but that's a minor component then. The most important component is where do you spend most time of your life. And if you, in your work life, it's the organization. So therefore you have to obey to the rules. If you do not obey to the rules, it's not easy for them to say, okay, now it's 5 o'clock, we go home, like we do in our context. No, you have to go out with the colleagues and do something together. If you do not obey to the rules, then you kind of cannot preserve harmony, the concept which I addressed in the beginning. Okay, and this already brings us to this concept of harmony, one of those main principles in the Japanese context. Harmony is also called wa, 2 letters, W-A, and this is something that kind of you can find in every context when you interact with Japanese. So they will hardly try to initiate a fight with you. They will not address a problem, as I said before. Whatever kind of puts danger on your relationship, on your network of relationships, has to be avoided. Okay. So what are the 3 pillars in the Japanese society? Well, it's the group orientation. Also, of course, it's the hierarchy, and the hierarchy comes from Confucianism, once again, subordination, what I said before. And then, of course, related to hierarchy is always the concept of respect. You have to respect all others in your group, but of course, also your superiors. And there are a few more concepts which will be reflected in the responsibility concept, and those cultural concepts are the concept of on, and those are things that again are very difficult to understand in a Western context. What does this mean? On is an obligation that is passively occurred. So basically, all Japanese people are born into this concept of on, and they have a lifetime, a lifelong obligation towards other people. What are those obligations? They say, well, it's an obligation towards the emperor. It's an obligation towards elder people, as we said before, from Confucianism again. It's the obligation towards your parents. It's all lifelong, and you don't choose that. It's passively occurred because you're Japanese. You have this, and you have to obey to it. And how can this be expressed in daily life? You know, the way of greeting is they don't shake hands, but they bow. But there is a big difference in how you bow. You can bow very deeply, very low, or you can just bow a little bit. And this again depends on the hierarchy, on the respect, on the group you're in, and on this concept of on, this passively occurred obligation. Everyone knows, well, if it's a senior person, a person with more experience, if it's your teacher or whoever, then you have to bow much lower than when it's your friend, when you greet. And so this is something kind of internalized, and everybody grows up with this, educated with. Then the next principle is this concept of giri. This is also an obligation, but now on the contrary, it's not passively occurred, but it's active. What does that mean? Well, everyone is indebted to other people in the society, in particular to the people from your different groups you are part of. So if somebody does you a favor, you're also required to pay back this favor. And again, they say with mathematical equivalence. So it shouldn't be more what you pay back, but it shouldn't be less. So if somebody helps you with something, then sooner or later you have to help your colleague with a similar thing. And this is within a limited period of time. So for example, a colleague helps you with, I don't know, a presentation for writing a paper or whatever, then you're kind of in debt, and you have to pay back and return the favor sooner or later. If you fail to do so, then again it will have effects on your group relationship and on this concept of harmony, which will be disturbed. Then they also have this context of a concept of amae, and amae is kind of a glue, and they say this glue kind of holds the Japanese society together. Amae is like the feeling what a mother has to her child, so a very close feeling, a feeling of closeness. Yeah? And Japanese, as they all live those concepts in daily life, they also have this glue that bonds them together, and that makes them somehow strong. Yeah? And you can see that nowadays, even if this now sounds so far-fetched, but you can see how it works, because if you remember the nuclear accident in Fukushima, what has happened? A lot of people were killed, a lot of people still suffer from the aftermath, a lot of people lost everything, but somehow the Japanese people, through this Amae, they were much stronger to cope with this fate than any other nation would have been. Yeah? Because what would other nations have done typically? Well, the first thing, if we think of more Germanic context, the US context, people would have tried to get what? If you lose everything, you probably want something back, you want a new house, and you kind of demand something from the government, whatever. But in Japan it worked differently. It was the mutual support of everybody who helped, to provide everybody with accommodation, with food and everything. Yeah? And this is much, much stronger than in the Western world. So this can also be explained by this concept of Amae. And all those relations are called in the Japanese term ningen kankei. Well, the Japanese society is a network of those relationships. Of course, as I said before, hierarchy plays a very important role. So all people have their position in hierarchy, and this position is respected and acknowledged by everybody. Okay, so much about this cultural difference. I looked up a little bit about Uruguay, and Uruguay, there are not so many cultural studies I'm familiar with, but if, again, you refer to the most famous one by Hofstede afterwards came up with some features for Uruguay as well. And according to Hofstede, Uruguay is also rather collectivist, collectivist society. So this means the family is very important as well. So probably you can teach me better if that is true or not. I wouldn't say that the family is not important with us, but it depends on the situation. Also referring to another cultural study by Holland Hall, Uruguay is high context. So there's a lot of information in the situation, and there's a Uruguayan, you can always interpret the situation and you know how to react respectively. Whereas with us, it's rather low context. So we, in general, need a lot of information. You have to tell us a lot about particularities, about typical features of another culture. And in Uruguay, most people are known to be more polychronic, so they can do a lot of things at the same time, whereas we're more monochronic. We usually have to follow one agenda after the other. We have to finish one task, and when we're finished, we can start with the next task. Whereas here, probably you can talk to one person and then pick up the phone, and you can, I don't know, maybe write a few things and then have another conversation. With us, it's more important to get more peace, to finish one thing, and when we finish, we can concentrate on the next thing. So those are all those features that were kind of found for Uruguay as well. So regarding Uruguay, probably we are more on the collectivist side, but this doesn't mean that Uruguay is like Japan or many Asian countries with regard to the acceptance of responsibility, as we'll see now in a minute. But that's actually a very important, very interesting point we can address afterwards in the discussion. So this paper now, what we wrote about was that we found out there are different concepts of responsibility in cultures, and in particular between West and East, as I said before, and this refers to the acceptance of responsibility and also to so-called defense mechanism. So how do we cope with responsibility, in particular in the organizational context? Who has to take over responsibility? Is it the overall organization? Is it just one particular manager? Who has to react if something goes wrong in society? And as I presented before, this is all rooted in philosophical thoughts and also in the history, in the historical development, which will then influence this ascription and the defense mechanisms. And as I said, we'll illustrate it with 2 case studies. But first of all, let's look in the Occidental concept of responsibility, or in other terms, into the concept of responsibility in the Western world. In the West, responsibility is always based on causality and the individual. And we can see already, we are very individualistic, so the person, the individual, is always most important. And it's always related to a specific cause. So if there is a negative occurrence, we always link this to the individual who has caused something. And there is this concept of the exculpatory response, which means we always have to justify our actions. And responsibility therefore can be ascribed to an agent according to Kant, a so-called psychophysic unity. And this agent can act intentionally, it has the free will to act, and the agent is also able to kind of consider the consequence of its action. So those are the main things. And I said the roots are in philosophy and the roots are also in history. And where can we find that? Well, if you look in 15th century in the Christian belief as well, or nowadays as well in people who believe in God or Catholics, there is this concept of the day of reckoning. So when you die, then if you go to heaven, what will you have to do? You have to kind of justify what you have done in life according to their religious belief. Yes, on the day of reckoning, God will tell you were you good or bad, or ask you were you good or bad, and then you have to justify why you were good or why you were bad, and then the decision will be made, hell or heaven. So this comes from the Christian belief in the 15th century, and this was then taken over also in the 19th century. Structural changes, division of labor, also technological revolution, and it became more and more important that people had to take over responsibility for what they've done. If you mounted something in the wrong way and you caused some damage, then of course you were responsibility for the error, or you were responsibility for the failure you caused. So in order to sum up, well, the ontological dimension, well, the study of the being, which says there's only one truth, there is only one moral, there is only one reality. We always have this causal action, this relationship of autonomous individuals with their abilities, once again, psychophysic unity, ability to act, freedom to act, and also being able to reflect the consequences of your behavior. The normative dimension is the focus on the individual blame. So who is to blame for whatever has happened? And of course, if we find someone who we can blame, what will we do in the Western world? Well, in the Western world, we'll try to punish the person for the error the person has caused. And this has then been translated into laws, and therefore we talk about the legalistic culture of guilt. So everything can be dealt with by specific laws the Western society came up with. If we compare that now again to the Japanese concept, well, as we said, highly collective society. So it's all based on the intersubjectivity and on the community. It's about the relationship between people, the common sense a group of people has developed. And according to Doi and Benedict, there are so-called webs of relations, which I presented before. The Giri, the On, there's another concept of Gimu, there is this Ningen Kankei, there is this Amae, then there is this Ba harmony concept. So many, many different concepts, things we generally don't even think about in our Western world. And the responsibility for individual action is not clearly defined because it's always linked to a group. It's always linked to the collective. Very interesting too, for a very long time in Japanese history, the term responsibility in the language did not really exist. Responsibility, the understanding of responsibility was always linked to the position a person has in society. If I can refer one more time to the times of the samurai, the job was to kind of protect a specific group of people in a village. And of course, it was clear that according to the status the samurai had in society, he was responsible for protecting everyone. So there was no need for the term responsibility. Only in the Meiji area in Japan, as of 1868 till 1912, well, there was a strong Western influence because before Japan closed itself up, because there were no connections to the outside world for more than 200 years. And then in the Meiji period, they tried to follow up with the Industrial Revolution, and they tried to get as much information from the Western world to become this powerful nation they are today, or they, let's say, at least used to be. So in this Meiji period, they also took on some laws from the Western world, or some concepts. And with the introduction of those laws, also the term responsibility came into the Japanese context, or came to Japan. And what does this mean now? The term consists of two characters, seki and nin. And the seki is the guilt, and the nin again is what was previously understood by responsibilities without having this terminology. It depends on the status of the person in the society. And this is something very, very important, which nowadays also has effects on how responsibility is handled in Japan. So the collective responsibility, to sum up, is incurred by a web of relations. Then the honor, the status, and the relations dominate the causal effect. Before we said in the Western concept, it's always the causal effect, individual and negative occurrence, not in Japanese concept. There is a symbolic basis, which means there is no legalistic culture of guilt, but there is a so-called culture of shame. And this culture of shame, again, is derived from the different morals and concepts which are introduced before. And it's also very interesting in comparison, because what was always important in the Western world, or in the Germanic world, was bravery, the individual achievement. The person who is brave, who can fight, that was the person that was honored. In the Japanese context, no, that was not important. This was only always the linkage to the group and the group context. So if we now try and transfer those ideas to the organizational concept, then we can sum up in the Occident or the Western world, we have the individualized culture of guilt, which is causally evidenced. In Japan, we have concept of the group responsibility with a so-called scapegoat function. You all understand scapegoat? Yeah? I looked it up, I think cabeza de turco. Cabeza turco, there is someone who is to blame. Okay, and this of course now has consequences on two levels, which I already mentioned before. First of all, the ascription of responsibility to the organization. And then on the organizational level, how can we accept responsibility? And the interesting thing is, what we found out, that responsibility is always culture specific, so it always depends on the cultural context. Of course, the context of Japan is very unique, and also the context of the Western world is rather unique, because, as I said before, we cannot generalize, because in the Western world, if we talk about the more southern countries, which are more collectivist, we cannot one-to-one translate this concept as our findings indicate here. So the societal implications. Well, I said in the West we focus on punishment, on retaliation. But the problem we have is that, well, everything is attributed to the individual, and the causal consequence of the action is central. But if we talk about an organization, how can we punish an organization? Yeah, because the concept of responsibility always refers to one individual, to one person. Now we could say, well, in the organization you have a top management, or probably you have one top manager. Yeah? But the organization itself is not an individual, and this is what causes problems or cause problems for a long period of time. And then in Japan, we said it's a focus on the subordination and the group membership. Punishment is not that important, but the group is the most important thing. Therefore, we speak about a collective responsibility, and the consequence of this action is secondary, but we cannot identify one specific person. Why? If we identify one specific person, it will disturb our harmony concept again, yeah? Because the group will protect all the individuals. Yeah? And the Japanese also have a saying, a proverb, and they say, the nail that sticks out has to be pounded down. So if one person from the group shows some special achievement or kind of sticks out for whatever the person is doing, then the rest of the group will have to make sure that they call this person back again. Show the person the limits, because it's not acceptable. You cannot show individual performance as we do in the Western world. For us, it's always me, the individual, what I achieve, what I do. That comes first. In the Eastern world, the group comes first. So if you break out from the group, you will have a big problem. Organizational implications. Well, the acceptance of the responsibility is considered to be an admission of guilt. So, because if I say, okay, you can make me responsibility for what has happened, then I basically admit. And if I admit, then I open the doors to be punished. Or I open the doors that you can punish me or retaliate. So the defense mechanism generally is auto-directed. So it means that you try to defend whatever you've done. You try to justify exculpatory response, as we said before in the basic concept. So we focus on the conflict. If you remember the picture, we go through the circle. We do not avoid the circle. We do not try to pass by. But what happens if we cannot find the individual who has caused the mistake, who has caused the error? Then we okay. I think the battery is gone. The battery is the last. Well, if we cannot find this individual, thank you. If we cannot find this individual, then we have the problem. Then we cannot blame anyone. So we reach our limits. Then no one is responsible. And if you think now of the organizational context, well, what do organizations do? For example, they pollute the environment. If they pollute the environment, according to the concept of responsibility in the Western world, we would have to identify the individual who polluted the environment. But actually, it is the organization, the mass of people, the whole sum of people who work for the organization that has to be held responsible for. But according to the Occidental concept of responsibility, we cannot easily punish the overall organization because we cannot say who is the causer of the pollution. And we could say, well, their management is responsible for the actions of the individuals in the organization. But this would not really match the concept of responsibility either. And the management would then easily say, well, I didn't do it myself. So you cannot lead, according to the law, you cannot punish me either. And I will show you now what difficult this general way of thinking caused in the past. In the Japanese context, well, the active acceptance of responsibility is not wanted, as we said, disturbs harmony. But what the Japanese have developed is this symbolic way of accepting responsibility by means of a so-called scapegoat. And who is the scapegoat? The scapegoat is the person that is defined by the status, the rank, the position the person has in society. If we translate it again to the context of organization, in the organizations, well, the person highest in rank, the top manager, the owner of the company, if it's a small company, is automatically named the scapegoat. And this person has to react. And now we're talking about this culture of shame. What does this mean? Well, the person will have to apologize for what has happened. Of course, we reach some limits here as well. We have this culture of apology, but then with a mere apology, everything is being settled, and we do not consider the further consequence anymore. And this is how kind of Japanese people react, and what the Japanese societies kind of demands from organizations if there is a misconduct that kind of affects the overall society. Let me now illustrate this by two case studies, because those case studies will make it a little bit clearer, which we have now elaborated on in a more theoretical way. Those case studies, there are many similar cases in the Japanese and also in the Western context, but those case studies are kind of similar. That's why we chose them with regard to this paper. The first case study is about a Japanese organization and the so-called supermarket incident. What happened was that a little boy went to a supermarket and they had an escalator. And the boy used the escalator to go up to the first floor. And the boy bent over the railing of the escalator. And when he reached the first floor, the boy got stuck between the ceiling and the railing of the moving escalator. And he was severely injured. Now, if we consider this from the Western perspective, and if we talk about acceptance of responsibility, taking over responsibility, who is to blame for this accident? What do you think? Or who would you say is to blame? The little boy goes up the escalator and he gets squeezed in between the ceiling and the moving escalator. Whose fault is that? Is it the company's fault? Is it the boy's fault? Is it the parents' fault? The company? Okay, well exactly, in Japanese, in Japan, no. This is of course different, but in the Western context, whenever you speak to people from Austria, I've often asked this question. Most people will say, well, first of all, the boy is to blame. Why did he go up without paying attention? Why did he should know, that you do not lean over on an escalator. Then, of course, it's the responsibility of the parents, because the parents have to mind what their child is doing in public. So the parents kind of, they missed out on their duties, and no one, or hardly anyone, would say, this is the fault of the organization. Completely different in the Japanese context. The Japanese will always say, well, this is the fault of the organization. Why? Because the organization should have had preventive measures that this accident could not have happened. But as you know, in our daily world, we learn from accidents. And nowadays, I don't know in Uruguay, but if you go to a department store in Europe, in Asia, everywhere they have some plastic devices that are hanging down from the ceiling before you reach the next floor. And those just before you reach the ceiling, it's kind of a protection measure that makes you move your hand back or move yourself back in order to prevent you from more harm and not being squeezed between the ceiling and the moving handrail. So this is something actually where organizations from the Japanese context starting to learn and establish those measures which are now prevalent over the world, I guess. I don't know, in Uruguay, if you go to a big department store, do you have those big department stores with different sections? Not shopping centers, but one huge big company and okay, yeah. So wherever in one building where the ceiling and the escalator meet, is that. And maybe next time you go abroad, you can observe that. Yeah. So once again, the Japanese say it's the responsibility of the organization, and the organization should have prevented this accident. So what was the reaction? And this is the typical reaction whenever something happens in Japan. How should the organization have reacted according to the Japanese society's opinion? Well, automatically a scapegoat was nominated. Who was the scapegoat? The scapegoat was the manager, the top manager of the producer of the escalator. Yeah? And without accusing the company who produced the escalator, the manager immediately went into public, and in general they do it by the media. They go to TV stations and they apologize in public for the misconduct of the organization. And this is a big difference too, because again, in the Western world, if that happened, in order to make people apologize for something, you will have to accuse them first. Yeah? In the Japanese context, it's an automatic reaction, yeah? Because they harm the overall society, and therefore they have to take action. Yeah? And what is the action? The action is this symbolic culture of shame, as I said before, because they are shamed for what has happened to the other members of the Japanese society, and therefore they have to go to public and apologize. Yeah? And with this apologize, the Japanese society is able and willing to forgive for what has happened. Yeah? Of course, there are many consequences linked to that. The main problem with the consequences is, well, after the apology, nothing else will happen. Yeah? That's basically it. Yeah? Well, a few things will happen, but the organization will also take care for the people, the person injured. Yeah? In this case, the organization automatically will pay for the recovery, for the medical treatment of the boy, will give support to the family, financial support. In the Western world, this would not be automatic. What would we have to do? Again, we would bring in the legalistic side. We would have to we'd have to sue the company and try to get the money back from them for the health cost, the recovery cost, and whatever. Yeah? Something that is automatic in the Japanese context. And this can only work again because they have those different concepts, those moral concepts. This amae, this glue that holds them together. There's a preservation of harmony and things like that. And next question that always arises is, what happens to the scapegoat? Well, the scapegoat makes the public apology and then steps down from his position. And intentionally I say his position because Japan is a very man-dominated society. So it's a man-dominated society, and so there are hardly women in powerful positions. So it's that person, the man, who has to step down, and who basically loses the position. But the position before, being the manager, defined that he has to act as the scapegoat. But after this, someone else will follow in the position. And now the question is, what happens to the manager, to this top manager? Well, again, in the Western context, what would happen to the person? The person would lose the job and probably be not very well off, because also his reputation would suffer. Because if you admit something in public, that's bad reputation which might be long lasting. In the Japanese context, we said it's a collective society, a group. So the group will kind of make sure that this manager will be reintegrated in the organization. And most of the time, this person will then be shifted to a sub-organization or somewhere else where he has another chance to move up the hierarchy. So the organization, the group, the collective will take care of the person. In our Western society, we would let the person fall. So the person would have to see how the person gets along. So this is very interesting too. And now, as I said, a very similar story, and this story is from a Swiss organization, a very famous elevator company, which you have here in Uruguay as well. It's a Swiss company, and they had at this similar time an accident in Japan as well. And what happened? Well, they built an elevator for a skyscraper, and also a teenager, a 16-year-old boy, used the elevator. And when the teenager tried to exit the elevator suddenly started to move very fast, and he jammed the boy as well, and the boy actually died. So what was the expected reaction of the Japanese society? The Japanese society expected the manager of the Swiss company to go into public in Japan and to apologize for what has happened. How did the Japanese company react? Of course, we have a different way of thinking, we have different moral concepts. I told you before, well, if we apologize, this equals an admission of guilt. If we admit our guilt, then we are liable, so that we can be sued or whatever. But the organization said, the Swiss organization said, it was not our fault. We had nothing to do with that, because at the time of the accident, the maintenance of the elevator was taken care of by a Japanese company. So we only produced the elevator, and as long as we maintained the elevator, everything was fine. But then after a couple of years, we lost the contract to a Japanese provider who was in charge of the maintenance, and the Japanese provider missed out on doing the proper maintenance, and therefore this accident could have happened. And therefore, why should we go to public and apologize? And the Japanese say, well, it doesn't matter, and that's something important one can learn for the marketing context as well. In Japan, you have a lifelong liability if you're a producer of a product. So it doesn't matter whether you maintain it or not. If you produce this product and it has your name on it, then you also have a lifelong responsibility. And therefore, this company or the boss of the company was expected to apologize in public. And it was not the intention of the Japanese to sue the company. For them, it was all about this cultural, this apology. This cultural characteristic which is necessary to preserve the harmony also in business relations. But of course, different thinking. The company was not familiar with the Japanese concepts either. They said that, so they went into intercultural training, and after a couple of months, they finally decided to give a statement in the Japanese media. And they said, okay, we're sorry for what has happened, but still we are not to be held reliable, which did not fulfill the purpose or the demands of the Japanese society. So what was the consequence? The elevator producer lost his market share in Japan. And nowadays, other companies have taken over, and they have the huge market share, and this Swiss company only produces a few elevators because the reputation of the company was destroyed forever. And once you destroy the reputation in a society like in Japan, then this has a very long-lasting effect, and it's very hard to re-establish a good relationship, because the Japanese then feel they cannot trust you anymore, because if you once destroyed the harmony, you will always do the same. So this is a very difficult thing as well. So yeah, as I said, they had no intention to accept the responsibility because it's an admission of guilt, and we always relate it to juridical facts. What is the conclusion? Well, as I said, in the Occident, we talk about the capability of accepting responsibility. We also reflect our actions, and we also link it to this psychophysic body, this unit, where the mind and the physical actions are connected. Collectives are not the subjects of responsibilities, but individual, and we have the problem of a societal vacuum. Why is the problem of the societal vacuum? Because in the organization, well, the managers will say, no, I'm not individually responsible, and therefore, well, do whatever you want, but you cannot really blame the company because there is no individual. It's very hard to, as I said, the example before, if you pollute a river, it's very hard to find out who actually opened the valve to let the dirt water in the river. This would be the person who can, according to the legalistic system, who can be blamed. But it's very hard to do that in a Western organization as well. But the management will always say, well, I'm not responsible because you cannot attribute that error, that mistake, individually to me, and therefore we have this vacuum of responsibility. In the Japanese context, well, the representative acceptance of responsibility, the main goal is always to protect the group, therefore they have the scapegoat. The scapegoat will be reintegrated in the organizational context, and the problem is, well, after the symbolic apology has been made, well, there is no further reaction from the organization. That's basically it. Everything else will be settled on the side. So again, preservation of harmony, no conflict. The organization will take care for all the people who were damaged or who were harmed. Okay, so much about this paper. There you find a little summary again of the main features. Let's see, we're well in time. So just to sum up, because this is now, I think, also interesting in the context of Uruguay. How would a Uruguayan company, for example, react if they had a similar situation? For example, if you produce something, would you be willing to apologize for a misconduct, like maybe in the case of the elevator accident? Or would you also think about the legalistic perspective? I think you're much closer to the Western concept of responsibility than to the Eastern concept of responsibility. But again, as I said before, Uruguay is a collective society. We are very individualistic people, or rather individualistic people. We don't rank as high in individualism as, for example, Americans do, but we are individualistic, of course. So that's why I said in the very beginning, it's always context specific, it's culture specific how we deal with that, and we cannot generalize. But in many Asian cultures, it's a very similar story. What I also would like to highlight is, because I spoke about this vacuum of responsibility, and we had this big problem in Austria in particular, because for a very long time, an organization in Austria could not be punished for misconduct just because of those traditional concepts of responsibility, because we had no legal basis to punish the organization. And I don't know if you've heard, we had a very, very big accident in Austria in 2000. There was a not a ski accident, but we have in one of our famous ski resorts in Kaprun, there was we have a special cable car. It's like a train, and the train goes uphill, and the train has to go through the mountain, through a tunnel. And what has happened was the train went up with 160 people on the train, and in the tunnel the train suddenly stopped and the fire broke out and all people were killed. So they burned in the tunnel, and the big problem was because, of course, there was a very international clientele as well, because they all came to Austria for skiing and they lost their lives there. So there was an international interest in kind of solving this problem as well. And they tried to find out who was to be held responsible for the accident. And of course, the producer of the train, the operator of the train, the people in the area all said, we are not responsible because we did not cause the fire. And in the end, it turned out that there was a heating system on the train that kind of caught fire, and in the tunnel, the suction that goes very fast, and so people couldn't be rescued anymore. So according to the results of the accident investigation, they said it was the heating system. So they tried to blame the accident to the producer of this heating system. And of course, those people or the manager also said, well, how can we be held responsible for that? It was a bad coincidence. We did everything right. It was serviced, was maintained, but it was just a bad coincidence. And then suddenly, our legalistic system, people started to think, the lawyers, and they said, no, this can't go on, It's such a big accident, and no one wants to take the blame for that. And so we started to work on a so-called company law. And this company law was first introduced 6 years later, in 2006 in Austria. And at the same time, also in England, they started to work on a company law as well. And this company law in Austria at least says, well, we cannot 100% exclude an organization from taking on responsibility. So it was formulated very vaguely, but it was the first attempt also to assign responsibility to an organization apart from this concept of individuals and cause, and which is linked to an occurrence. And so again, this was a very far-reaching development, and nowadays we have in 2017 we have a law that also allows us to punish companies, because if we hadn't come up with such a law, then according to our way of thinking, all companies could do whatever they want to do. They could pollute, they could destroy, they could, what often happens probably here as well, food that expired, where the expiry date has gone off, but the food is still good, so they repacked it and put it back into the supermarkets until someone found out about it. Those things, but if that happens now and someone finds out about it, then the organization, the company can be punished, which was not possible before. So therefore, all those accidents or all those investigations, they showed some results and some positive effect on the overall development of the legalistic system in Austria as well. Because, as we said, we base everything on our juridical system, the legal framework. Yeah? Okay, that's so much from my side. I hope you have a few questions. So as I said before, we can discuss this in the context of Uruguay. Again, I'm looking forward to your statements. Would you agree that Uruguay is more on the Western side with regard to the concept of responsibility? So is the legal system important as well? Yeah, more important. Do you have any cultural concepts that are important as well? I think I read about it.
No, I think there is no. Society has no. Well, I don't know how to explain, but we don't hope that everybody reacts or as the Asian cultures, as we always lead by the law, and well, that's if an accident happens, maybe it's just the damaged person will demand the company, and everything will be by the law, but not by a society response or something like that.
So the organization would not react from itself. So the organization would also wait for the damaged person to kind of approach and demand or sue the organization. Okay. It's very similar to what we are doing.
Wants to ask you why? Wait to the. Okay. she wants to ask you why did you decide to investigate on this topic?
Okay, I forgot to say it in the beginning because I studied Japanese as well and I lived in Japan. So for a longer period of time, and then in Japan I often on the news I heard about those apologies, or I saw that and it was very strange to me. I thought, what are they doing? And so I looked a little bit deeper into this thing, and then I thought, well, it's quite interesting. Why do they react in this way? Because if that had happened in Austria, no one would have even mentioned that. Yeah? And so that's why I got into the topic. And then I wrote this paper with my colleague from the CSR department in Austria, who is in business ethics. And he said, well, that's really interesting too, and we should look into the roots and the origin. Where does this come from? And then, so we found out, where do our thoughts emerge from? How do the Japanese thoughts kind of match, or where do they come from, or how do they differ more precisely? And then we looked into more and more cases, and finally decided on those two cases because they were very similar with the escalator and the elevator. Yeah. But that's actually my approach to the Japanese topic. Yeah. I know, of course, this is very unique, yeah? But in some cultures this holds true. For example, I taught in Korea as well, and I discussed this topic with the Korean students, and they fully agree with the Japanese concept. Why? Because Korea also has a lot of those morals and concepts that are based on Confucianism. They have a lot in common, like all the Asian cultures. Not everything is the same, but they would agree. They can understand why the Japanese react in that way, whereas the Koreans are a little bit different as well, and they wouldn't put that much emphasis on such a formalized apology, but the apology itself is important. For us, the apology in the Western context is not important at all. For us, it's important, what does the company do now? How does the company prevent more harm? What does the company do that this doesn't reoccur? In the Japanese context, no, it's the apology. And then what happens? Well, everybody believes that the company will not show any misconduct anymore because there's this, at my end, this high level of trust. We would trust the company, we just want to know, so what are you going to do next? But we don't care if you apologize or not, as long as you prevent things from happening again, and as long as the organization takes care of the people damaged. So this is a very different approach.
How do Asian cultures punish people when they broke the armament?
When they break what?
The armament.
Well, then
concept, when they
they are no, yes, they are no longer a member of the group, and either they try to get them back into the group, they kind of tell them how to behave, and if they still reject, those are the people who end on the street. So they lose their network in society, and they drop them. And then it's very, very hard to be reintegrated again. Yeah. So, because if you go to the big cities in Japan, of course, you can also see homeless people. And those are all the people who fell through the Japanese society and the network because they did not want to obey to those regulations. But of course, to be honest, you have to admit that the younger generation now has a little bit of a different approach as well. Not all the young Japanese are that kind of affiliated to the old traditional values anymore. And you can see that because I don't know, do you get Japanese students here in Uruguay, exchange students? No, because they start more and more to travel. In the past, Japanese students would have never gone alone. Yeah? But now they travel more and more, and some of them try to break out. And the big problem is once they know how it works in other countries, in the outside world, it's very hard for them to go back. So we get Japanese students and they have difficulties reintegrating in the Japanese society after spending 1 year abroad. Yeah? And then they say, I don't want this system anymore. Yeah? I want more freedom, I want to be more individual. So there is, and I'm sure in future there will be a big change going on, but cultures only develop slowly or change slowly. So it is not something that happens from 1 year to the other. Maybe in the next 20 years, it will become more and more individualistic. And the Japanese, they always adapted to the Western world, and they picked up a lot from the Western world, tried to integrate it in their way. And sometimes they're successful and sometimes not. At the moment they struggle a lot because they have a lot of those in the HR context, so-called freeters, free timers. I don't know if you heard about that concept, free timers. Japanese word is frita, also in the English literature they use this term now. Those are people who voluntarily decide to break out from the traditional system and to do their own things. So they forego a good job in an organization, or they forego their studies at the university because they say we are too much restricted. And what we want is we want to decide our own lives. What is normal for us in the Western world, we make our own decisions. We don't want our decisions always to be influenced by anybody else. And so some Japanese people do that as well. And so what they do is they take a little job in a convenience store, for example. They don't make much money, but they just have enough money to earn the living. And then they do this job for a couple of times, and when they have enough money, then they take a break for 2 months again. And then they go abroad, or they try to find another job again. And so they fight themselves more or less through their lives. This, of course, also has societal implications because those people can hardly afford an apartment and or a place to live. So what happens? Those people move back to their families. So you have to imagine you're suddenly 30 or 35 and suddenly you have to go back to your parents and ask them, can I move in with you again? How difficult it is. And so a lot of problems for the younger generations, but just because of the fact that they say we no longer want to do what is always expected from us to do. And therefore they want to go their own individual way. But of course, only a few, if you look at the overall Japanese society, it's a small part, but it's increasing. So this will be a big threat, and literature is already being discussed. It's a big threat for the Japanese society and the labor markets. Any other questions, other comments?
What happens with the Japanese organizations that are set up abroad?
When they are abroad?
Yeah, do they rule by the Japanese culture
Yes.
or by the Western culture?
Well, if it is a Japanese organization which has an affiliate abroad, then it's dominated by the Japanese culture, and they all have to operate according to the Japanese rules. Because they send their own people. The management is always Japanese then, if it's a Japanese company. Otherwise, if people decide to move abroad, and that's a different story, then they have to try and integrate in the organizational culture of the respective countries to move to. But if it's a Japanese organization, it's strongly influenced from home.
Sorry. Well, thank you very much for coming. We know you have another lecture right now. Yes. No, not here, but yes, in the classroom. So, if you don't have another question, no? Do you like the conference?
Yes, very good.
Well, let's clap again.